I want to tell you about Mandela, who taught the world that forgiveness can be more powerful than revenge, that reconciliation can triumph over retribution, and that the human spirit can emerge unbroken even after decades of the most dehumanizing treatment imaginable. This is the story of Nelson Mandela, whose journey from a small village boy to the most revered leader of our time represents one of the most extraordinary transformations in human history. When I think about Mandela's early life, I am struck by the profound irony of his Xhosa name, Rolihlala, which translates to pulling the branch of a tree, or more colloquially, Troublemaker. Little did anyone know that this child, born on July 18, 1918, in the tiny hamlet of Mvezo, along the banks of the Mbashe River in the Eastern Cape, would indeed become the greatest troublemaker the apartheid system had ever encountered, shaking the very foundations of institutionalized racism to their core. I find myself deeply moved when I consider how this young boy, whose traditional African name was deemed too difficult for colonial sensibilities and was replaced with Nelson by a British missionary teacher, would grow up to embody the struggle between two worlds. The world of his ancestors, with their rich oral traditions and communal values, and the harsh reality of a colonized nation, where the color of one's skin determined the entire trajectory of one's existence. As I trace Mandela's path through his formative years, I see a brilliant mind being shaped by contradiction and injustice. A young man who excelled in his studies while simultaneously witnessing the systematic degradation of his people through laws designed specifically to keep black South Africans in perpetual subjugation. When he pursued his legal studies walking through those dusty corridors of South African courthouses, I imagine him observing with growing indignation how the very concept of justice was perverted to serve the interests of white minority rule. How laws were crafted not to protect the innocent or punish the guilty, but to maintain a racial hierarchy that benefited the few at the expense of the many. The year 1944 marked a pivotal transformation in Mandela's life when he joined the African National Congress and co-founded the ANC Youth League alongside his contemporaries, young men and women who shared his vision of a South Africa free from the shackles of racial oppression. I am profoundly inspired by their initial commitment to nonviolent resistance, their belief that moral persuasion and peaceful protest could eventually penetrate the hearts and minds of their oppressors. But I also understand the devastating disillusionment that followed events like the Sharpeville Massacre of 1960, when 69 peaceful protesters were gunned down by police, their blood staining the ground and shattering forever the illusion that change could come without sacrifice. The decision to take up arms through the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the military wing of the ANC, represents one of the most agonizing moral crossroads in Mandela's journey. A moment when a man of peace was forced to acknowledge that sometimes violence becomes the only language that tyranny understands. I can only imagine the weight of responsibility he felt as he transitioned from lawyer to revolutionary, knowing that this path would inevitably lead to his capture and imprisonment, yet understanding that the alternative, continued submission to apartheid's brutality, was simply unacceptable. When Mandela was finally arrested in 1962 while traveling under the assumed identity of David Motsamai, I see not just the capture of a man, but the moment when South Africa's conscience was imprisoned, when the voice of reason and justice was silenced behind bars. The riveting trial that followed, culminating in his famous declaration that democracy and freedom were ideals for which he was prepared to die, transformed a courtroom into a stage upon which the moral bankruptcy of apartheid was exposed for the entire world to witness. The 27 years that followed on Robben Island represent perhaps the most remarkable period of spiritual and intellectual growth in modern history, a time when a man confined to a cell measuring barely 2 meters by 2.5 meters somehow managed to expand his influence across continents and decades. I am awed by Mandela's ability to transform his prison into what he called a university of resistance, and where he not only maintained his own dignity and purpose, but also mentored younger prisoners, studied Afrikaans to better understand his captor's mindset, and somehow emerged from nearly 3 decades of incarceration, not bitter and broken, but wise and magnanimous. The government's repeated offers to release him in exchange for renouncing the struggle reveal the profound misunderstanding of his character. They failed to grasp that for Mandela, personal freedom was meaningless without collective liberation, that his individual comfort was insignificant compared to his people's dignity, and that true leadership sometimes requires the ultimate sacrifice of remaining imprisoned when one could walk free. When those prison gates finally opened on February 11, 1990, and I watched that iconic footage of Mandela walking hand in hand with Winnie, his steps measured and his gaze steady, I witnessed not just the release of a political prisoner, but the emergence of a moral giant whose first instinct was not revenge, but reconciliation, whose message was not retribution, but Rainbow Nation unity. The transformation of South Africa through those tumultuous transition years, culminating in the historic April 1994 elections when millions of black South Africans voted for the first time, represents democracy's greatest triumph over oppression. Perhaps what moves me most profoundly about Mandela's legacy is his voluntary decision to serve only one presidential term, his conscious rejection of the cult of personality that has corrupted so many liberation leaders, and his final words upon leaving office. "I am not a saint unless you think of a saint as a sinner who keeps on trying." In these words, I hear the voice of authentic greatness, the humility of a man who understood that true leadership lies not in accumulating power, but in empowering others, not in building monuments to oneself, but in constructing bridges between divided communities. Mandela's story teaches us that our circumstances do not define our character, that even in humanity's darkest moments we retain the power to choose forgiveness over hatred, hope over despair, and love over fear. If this man could emerge from 27 years of imprisonment with his soul intact and his vision of reconciliation undimmed, then surely we too can break free from whatever prisons confine our own spirits and become the presidents of our own destinies.